It's lovely to be back with you. Last time I spoke on the theme of women in waiting. For this Advent reflection, I want to speak on the theme of women arising. And I'm seeking to ask how the gospel message empowers us as women, despite the obstacles and struggles we face, to persist in recognising that we are the bearers of good news, that hidden in plain sight in the Gospels is the vocation of women to go out and preach the good news, to recognise Jesus Christ as the Saviour of the world, and to recognise in him our own liberation from the captivity of history, from a captivity of women's oppression and subordination, and that when we continue to find ourselves pushed into those roles by our leaders in the church and in politics and in secular society, we are dealing with the old Adam. We are dealing with a narrative that is unredeemed. And our task, I believe, difficult though it is to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves, but to arise and to proclaim what we know to be true, that in Jesus Christ all people are restored to the original goodness of creation, that we all stand equal in dignity and rights before God and before one another, and we are called to a discipleship of co-equals, whatever our gender, whatever our culture or context, to work hand in hand for the bringing of God's kingdom of justice and peace into our suffering and wounded world. So my themes today are naming, freedom and arising. And what do those things mean if we go back and look with fresh eyes at the story of women in the Gospels? So I hope you enjoy this short journey together through looking at some Gospel passages anew and discovering ourselves there and hearing our voices there, perhaps for the first time, realising how free we are and how we might use that freedom. So let's begin. I want to begin by reflecting on the importance of naming. And here I'm referring to the work of feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble. Phyllis Tribble points out that in the myth of Genesis, and when I call it a myth, we must remember that myths often speak a deeper truth than facts. Of course, the Genesis story is a myth, but I believe that it reveals very profound truths about the human condition and the ways in which we struggle and suffer through history, guided always onwards by a vision that it doesn't have to be like this, that indeed this is not the way God calls the world to be, and that we are on a journey towards a better world, which we have a vision of as somehow rooted in our ancient past, as well as in our promised future. And Tribble says this of the naming in Genesis: Adam gave names to all the animals, but there wasn't anyone found suitable for him. And when the woman appears on the scene, I'm not going to go into all the Hebrew here, but when the woman appears, he calls her woman, and it's a word of recognition. And it's only after the fruit has been eaten, alienation and blame have arrived on the scene, however we explain that, that Adam calls Eve by name. Now, why does this matter? It's as if a little cat walks into my room now and I say, there's a cat. I'm calling it by the kind of thing it is, but I'm not claiming any ownership of it. It's a word of recognition, not of ownership. But if the cat walks into the room and I say, oh, there's a cat, I'm going to call it Susie, I've claimed ownership of that cat. I've claimed authority over it. It's my right to name it. And Tribble makes the point that in the second naming formula in the book of Genesis, Adam calls Eve by name. The name he gives her is mother of the living or life. It's a complex Hebrew word. It implies life. But Tribble says even as he gives her the name of life, he exercises his power over her. So in this naming of Eve, we see the first act of male domination over the woman who was created to be his free and equal companion in the garden of creation. And I'm going to come back to that theme of naming repeatedly. The other point I want to make is the nature of the woman's punishment. Now, it's important, Tribble makes the point, these are not curses, they're consequences. They're not God's desire for creation. They are the consequences of human alienation and rebellion, however we understand that. But they are the consequences, the pain and the suffering that result from our rejection of God. And let's never forget that Christ's coming is to heal that wound of alienation and rejection. And what does the woman suffer as a consequence of this? She suffers sorrow in her conceptions. Note, it's not just in childbirth, it's in conceptions. And she suffers desire for the husband who lords it over her, a kind of masochistic desire for the one who will abuse her. Now, it's important, of course, to say that this is not to say that every man abuses women or all women are abused, or indeed that every act of pregnancy, conception, childbirth is necessarily one of intense suffering, although I think there usually is a fair bit of suffering associated with all that one way and the other. But it is to say that when human beings inflict unnecessary suffering on women in the name of a kind of domination over our reproductive bodies and our relationships, then we are seeing human institutions perpetuating the consequences of Genesis, and the whole Christian story is about liberating us from those consequences. So when we think that 300,000 of the world's poorest women die every year from causes relating to pregnancy and childbearing, including illegal and unsafe abortions, when we think of how domestic violence spirals out of control, sex trafficking, the abuse of women, and when we think that particularly with regard to maternal and reproductive suffering, there is hardly anything in Catholic social teaching about that. There is a fair bit about trafficking, there are nice generalities about violence against women, but as Polish women know all too well, the assertion of control over the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of women's lives remains very much part of the business of many of those leaders in the church. And we need to remind them that this is perpetuating the consequences of something from which Christ came to redeem us. We've recently celebrated the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is a hard one for many women because we're told it's associated with Mary's virginal purity and freedom from sin, and that can feel very oppressive. But we can read this, I believe, in a different way as the beginning of the narrative of women's redemption. Now, again, there's a great deal I could say that we don't have time for now, but I'm going back to a very early Christian text from the 2nd century, the Protevangelium of James, where we have an account of the birth of Mary to her elderly mother Anna, who's modelled on Samuel's mother Hannah of the Hebrew Scriptures. And here is the passage which describes Mary's birth. After 9 months, Anna gave birth, and she said to the midwife, "What is it?" The midwife said, "A girl." Anna said, "My soul exalts this day," and she put her baby to bed. We often see these images, by the way, and think that they are nativities, the birth of Christ, but actually it's the birth of Mary, and you can tell when the birth takes place in a rather lovely bedroom. Some suggest that this was medieval women wanting to see themselves reflected in the story of Christ, and so St. Anne becomes a rather fertile and prolific wife of the bourgeoisie in these images. But what's important is that usually in history, and still today in many societies, the birth of a girl is not a cause for thanksgiving. And for me, this is where God begins to break in with a new story about women and our place in history. It's the day when Mary's mother Anna exalts God for giving her a daughter. So we could say a lot more about that, but can we just think about that? do we in our lives really feel that it was a good thing to be born? Do we feel that people exulted over our birth and welcomed us into the world? Many of us probably do, but many women don't, for many complex reasons. Many women find themselves unwanted in this world from the very moment of their birth, and indeed from before, if we remember how often sex selection is a factor in abortions in societies which have a great deal of poverty and which privilege the birth of boys over girls. So a lot to think about there. But what I really want to say is let's just begin at the beginning of women's redemption, which for me is when Mary's mother exults over Mary's birth. So let's go to the beginning of the story of the Incarnation, which of course starts with an angel telling Zechariah that his wife is going to have a child. And Zechariah is in the temple, he's a priest, and he challenges the angel. How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man and my wife is well on in years. And what happens to Zechariah? The angel silences him. Now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words. Now, this is strange when we think about it, because what happens when Mary encounters an angel? She also asks a very similar question. How will this be? And she's not silenced. She's given an answer. And as I think I said last time, the answer comes not in the form of a miracle that allows her to escape the suffering to come, but in the form of a companion, a sister to walk this road with her, rocky and difficult though it is. Elizabeth is there. But there's another point I want to make about this, and again for many women the idea of Mary's virginity is a problem because it's been used so often against female sexuality, against the healthy expression of female sexual desire. But you know, when I reflect on this, I think, what would happen if this wasn't a virgin birth? Mary would have had to go to Joseph, and Joseph would have had the final authority over the Incarnation. There would have had to be an act of sexual intercourse. There would have had to be a phallic intervention. There is none. And to me, we don't read this as a condemnation of human sexuality. We don't read it as a call to a kind of virginal modesty, but we read it as the liberation from that consequence of what happened in the beginning, when the woman's desire was for her husband and he would lord it over her. Mary's desire is for God, and her husband becomes her humble servant in a way. Joseph has to make himself the one who serves his wife's vocation, and his permission, his sexual intervention is not needed. It's enough for Mary to consecrate herself to God, for Mary to say, let it be, and Christ becomes incarnate through a woman's word, not through a man's phallic power over her body. So we can rethink the virgin birth. You know, I always think it's better when we're confronted with mysteries. It's better when we're confronted with the profound doctrines of our faith. If we do believe in what the church is, in spite of all its many failings and offences, I think we have to look deeply into the story it tells and say, have we misread it, and how can we liberate a different meaning? So for me, we begin to liberate different meanings when we reflect on this silencing of the priest, the authority, the one with religious power, and this giving voice to a woman in order to say, let it be, and to invite Christ back into the fabric of the material world and into the lives of humankind. This is the first great homily. The Magnificat is the first time somebody considers and contemplates the events of the incarnation, remember Jesus has already been conceived. Jesus is already flesh of our flesh and blood of our blood. He is already in this material world, redeeming us even from within Mary's body before he's born. When people emphasize that our redemption comes through the cross, through this narrative of suffering and torture and blood, they seem to forget that if redemption hadn't come with Mary's yes, Christ wouldn't have been God from the moment he was conceived. But in the Magnificat, we see what this means for all people, and particularly for the lowly woman of the world. It's a world that has already come into being, not a call to revolution, but a call to inhabit the new world that is already here with the incarnation, with Mary's conception of Christ. It's a call to live in the knowledge that this is the real world, and the world of oppression, the world of domination and division and poverty and injustice and kingship and rulership and hierarchy has been overthrown from within. And it's pregnant women who are called to interpret this event and to announce the good news to the world. All generations shall call me blessed. So again, I'm wanting us to reflect on the Magnificat as the very particular way in which God calls women, so long condemned to silence, to speak out and announce the good news. And it's pregnant women, women who will know maternal suffering for sure, but who are entrusted with the new life, not just of the children they bear, but of the word that has to be interpreted and preached if those children's lives are to be understood. And here's something else I want to say. I began by speaking about naming as part of that first alienation, that first rejection of the harmony and beauty and fragility of God's good creation, when Adam names Eve. And as we know all through history, the power to name has been that of men who exercise such power, the power to control by naming, the power to acquire knowledge and power by naming. Even sometimes I smile at the fact that when you're pregnant, your body gets mapped in English anyway by syndromes that were named by men. They call those contractions that we often experience as pregnancy develops Braxton-Hicks contractions. There are all sorts of aspects. Montgomery's tubercles are the little pimples we get around our nipples when we're pregnant. They're all men's names given to our bodies. And that's why I think we need to go back and look at what happens when these children are conceived, John the Baptist and Jesus. Mary is told what she is to name her child. Mary is given the power to name. And likewise, Zechariah is silenced, and it's Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, who gives his name. So here at the beginning of the incarnation, women are called to name in the way that's been refused to them through all of history. And I wonder in your life if you can think of examples where you've been denied the power to name, denied the power to name our own experiences, denied the power to name our own desires, denied even the power to name our own children sometimes. And what would it feel like for you to claim this power to name, not as an act of aggression, not as an act of power over, but as an act of the dignity that emanates from within, when we are given the language and the words to name our reality and to claim it and to live it as something uniquely ours and given to us by God through grace. Maybe you want to just reflect on that a little bit, the power to name. There's so much more that could be said on each of these topics, and what I'm trying to do this morning is just to open some windows and doors in the biblical text and to invite you to walk through them and see how different it might look if we view them from the perspective of the women who were there and ask what it meant. And I've just chosen 3 more little scriptural texts here to continue that point of saying it's women's voices that are given authority. It's women who are brought centre stage in the incarnation. And these women are named and recognised as the companions and disciples, and sometimes I think as the teachers of Jesus. So of course we know from John's Gospel that it's Jesus's mother who initiates the first miracle, and she almost seems to override what can seem like a rebuke. She knows that she has to usher in his public ministry in the way that she gave birth to Jesus. I believe in John's Gospel, she gives birth to Christ. She gives birth to the first miracle. She enables the revelation of who Christ is to be shown to the world, just as once she enabled the body of Christ to be brought into the world. And note how in John's Gospel Christ calls her woman. Always in John's Gospel it's woman. And some biblical scholars say this is because Mary represents the new Eve. The woman who in the beginning was blamed and shamed is here brought into the fullness of her dignity and authority as she ushers in this first miracle of turning the water into wine. Again, there's so much more to be said, but maybe you'd like to reflect on this. And of course, the Samaritan woman at the well, his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. And this woman goes running off and tells the people in her village, come and see someone who told me everything I've ever done. Could he be the Messiah? It's women who first begin to recognise who this person might be. Mary, the mother of Jesus, has birthed him into his full ministry, and now women begin to see who he might be. And that theme is continued if we look at the raising of Lazarus and Martha's words to Jesus. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. There is an enormous authority of recognition given to women when we go through the doors of Scripture differently and find ourselves in quite different rooms from those we've been told we're meant to occupy in the institutional church. And of course, the sublime example of what I'm talking about this morning is when Mary of Magdala witnesses the resurrection or encounters the risen Christ. There are, of course, no witnesses to the actual resurrection, but she encounters the risen Christ in the garden when Christ comes out of the tomb. Now, in the early and medieval church, many interpreters saw this again as a replay of the scene of the fall in Genesis, that Mary encounters the risen Christ in a garden, and in that encounter the wounds of alienation are healed. She's weeping outside the tomb. How often do we as women in various aspects of our lives, not just in the church, how often do we find ourselves sitting outside what feels like the tomb of the dead God, weeping because it seems that nothing can be done? And yet Mary keeps faith. She does stay at the tomb. After Peter and the other men have gone, Mary stays at the tomb patiently waiting and weeping. And again we see this word woman used by Jesus. Why are you crying? And note what happens. She doesn't recognise him at first. She recognises him when he says her name, Mary. So we've come full cycle. In the beginning, the man names Eve as a way of asserting his domination over her. And interestingly, Jesus names Mary and tells her not to cling to him. Now, the word is translated in English as do not touch me sometimes, but it has in Greek a much more it's an erotic word. It refers to clinging sometimes in a sexual kind of way. And I like to think that maybe this is a liberation from that suffering that Eve will experience because she desires the man who will lord it over her. Maybe Mary of Magdala desires the body that Jesus is, desires him in a way that will trap her rather than free her. So in saying don't cling to me, Jesus is actually setting her free. And of course we know that he sets her free with a mission and a vocation. So Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary of Magdala is called to be the apostle to the apostles. That was a title used of her in the early and medieval church. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary of Magdala's feast day to that of the other apostles, and for the first time in the liturgy we use the term in the preface apostle to the apostles. Mary, if we want to interpret this way, was the first priest, the only priest to be ordained by Jesus Christ, actually, if we take this mandate to go and tell as the vocation to priesthood. What is this telling us? So there's a great deal more that I could go on and say, but I want us just to reflect on these themes of naming, of wounding and distorted desire, the desire that holds women down, the suffering that women experience in childbirth, and the story of the incarnation from the conception of Jesus up until the encounter with the risen Christ in the garden is a story that focuses on women as the central players in the story of the redemption. Now, of course, this isn't to play sexual politics. It's not to play silly games of women are better than men or women are redeemed more than men. It's simply to say that what seems very obvious, that the ones throughout history who have always and everywhere been made subordinate, been in one way or another positioned as inferiors in every culture and context and religion, are in the story of Christ restored to the dignity and equality and goodness of that relationship in creation. And our call is not to lose sight of that as we struggle through history towards that redemption that will always elude us. There will always be struggle, there will always be failure, there will always be new regimes that rise and trample on us again. But we should never lose the hope that what we're living is the world of the Magnificat. What we're called to enact and incarnate in our own lives is that world of dignity and freedom and liberation that have been made real. And we only need to live it in order to experience it and to persevere no matter what the obstacles, because women have a very particular vocation in the Gospels, and I believe in the Church today, to speak from the margins to the centre and to say what's missing from the good news. And if we think that in Pope Francis's latest encyclical, he addresses brothers all, fratelli tutti, and in 288 footnotes he doesn't find a single space for a woman's voice, we've still got a long way to go before the men entrusted with Christ's message learn what that message is about. Thank you very much for sharing these times with me, and I look forward to being with you for a live chat later this week. Until then, farewell from now.
I never seen a real rainbow. I still believe though. Gotta believe though. It hurts me when people are fighting. Different street sides. Words cut like sharp knives. But it doesn't have to be that way. I will not believe that I'm the only one who has that dream. No, it doesn't have to be that way. What will it take to make You believe the change is coming.